Look at this satellite image from space. It's the Korean peninsula at night. On one side, South Korea blazes with light, cities glowing, highways illuminated, energy flowing through every street. On the other side, North Korea sits in almost complete darkness. Not a flicker, not a trace. Just a black void where tens of millions of people live. Same peninsula, same people, same history until 1953. The only difference is the system. One chose capitalism, one chose socialism, and 70 years later one burns bright while the other disappeared into the dark. But here's what makes this question more complicated than anyone admits. Right now in 2025, Cuba, a socialist country strangled by decades of embargoes and economic isolation, has a higher life expectancy than the United States. 79 years in Cuba, 76 years in America. A tiny Caribbean island with a GDP per capita, a fraction of America's, is keeping its people alive longer than the wealthiest nation in human history. How is that possible? How can capitalism produce South Korea's prosperity and America's medical crisis? How can socialism create North Korea's darkness and Cuba's surprising health outcomes? The contradictions don't make sense until you understand something most people never admit. Neither system worked the way the textbooks promised. Not once, not anywhere. And when the pressure hit, war, famine, economic collapse, the truth revealed itself with brutal clarity. This is the story of the longest ideological war in modern history. A century-spanning battle that killed millions, toppled empires, and split the world in half. And the answer to which system wins isn't what anyone expected. Before capitalism and socialism became battle cries, before anyone wrote manifestos or staged revolutions, the world operated on a simple principle. Power belonged to whoever owned the land. Kings ruled by divine right. Aristocrats inherited everything. Peasants worked until they died. For thousands of years, this was the only system humanity knew. Wealth didn't grow, it transferred. If someone gained, someone else lost. The economy was a zero-sum game where your birth determined your fate and innovation moved slower than glaciers. Progress wasn't a concept, survival was the goal. Then something unprecedented happened. Britain, in the late 1700s, became a pressure cooker of coal, iron, steam, and ambition. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how things were made. It detonated the entire structure of human civilization. Factories replaced workshops. Machines replaced muscle. And for the first time in history, individuals who weren't royalty could accumulate capital on a scale that rivaled kings. This was the birth of capitalism. Not a theory, not a philosophy, just a brutal, chaotic explosion of productivity that nobody had planned and nobody controlled. By 1800, British textile mills were producing cloth faster than entire nations had produced in centuries. Railways connected cities that had been days apart. Steam engines turned weeks of labor into hours. The wealth being created was beyond anything humanity had ever witnessed. But so was the misery. Factory workers, including children as young as 5, worked 14-hour shifts in conditions that would horrify modern observers. No safety regulations, no labor laws, no protections of any kind. The owners grew unimaginably rich, while workers died young in slums choked with pollution and disease. Wages were just enough to survive, but never enough to escape. The gap between the wealthy and everyone else widened faster than any society had experienced. And this inequality, this visible, undeniable brutality of early capitalism, created the reaction that would define the next 200 years. Enter Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They looked at the factory floors, the child laborers, the aristocrats living in palaces while workers starved, and concluded that the system itself was the crime. They published the Communist Manifesto in 1848. The argument was simple and seductive. Capital is stolen labor. The factory owner doesn't create wealth. The workers create it. The owner just extracts the profit. If workers collectively owned the factories, if production served human need instead of private greed, society would finally be fair. No more exploitation, no more boom and bust cycles, no more poverty amid plenty, just rational planning and equal dignity for all. It sounded clean. It sounded moral. It sounded like justice. And for millions of people living beneath the gears of industrial capitalism, it sounded like hope. But theory is one thing. Reality is something else, entirely. The first time socialism moved from theory to practice happened in the most dramatic way possible. 1917, Russia. The Tsarist Empire, which had ruled for 300 years, collapsed in 8 months. World War I had bled Russia dry. Millions dead. The economy shattered. Food shortages turning into starvation. And in November 1917, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power. They executed the Tsar and his entire family. They nationalized every industry. They abolished private property. They declared war on the old order and promised to build a workers' paradise from the ashes. This was it, the grand experiment. For the first time, a major nation would test whether socialism could actually work at scale. The Soviet Union would prove whether Marx was right or whether capitalism was the only system that could deliver prosperity, and the results were immediate and catastrophic. Without market prices, central planners had no idea what to produce or how much. Without competition, factories had no incentive to innovate or improve. Without personal reward, workers had no reason to exceed minimum effort. Production collapsed. Agriculture, the backbone of Russia's economy, fell into chaos. By 1921, famine killed 5 million people. The socialist dream was drowning in blood and starvation before it even began. Lenin, faced with total collapse, retreated. He allowed limited private trade. Small businesses reopened. Farmers could sell surplus crops. The new economic policy saved the Soviet Union from complete disintegration, but it also proved something Lenin never admitted. Pure socialism couldn't feed its own people. Yet despite this failure, despite the famine and the terror and the obvious dysfunction, socialism remained seductive. Why? Because capitalism wasn't exactly looking good either. By the 1920s, capitalism had delivered explosive growth, but also wild instability. Speculation ran rampant. Monopolies dominated entire industries. The wealthy lived like modern royalty while millions scraped by. And on October 24th, 1929, the system suffered its most catastrophic failure, the Great Depression. The U.S. stock market imploded, banks collapsed. Unemployment hit 25%. Entire countries saw their financial systems wiped out. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Farmers lost their land. Factories closed. Savings evaporated. For millions of observers worldwide, capitalism didn't just look flawed. It looked fatal. And suddenly, socialism, for all its obvious problems, started looking like a viable alternative. By the 1930s, the world was trapped between 2 failing systems. Capitalism promised prosperity but delivered collapse. Socialism promised equality but delivered scarcity and terror. The debate wasn't theoretical anymore. It was existential. And then came World War II, the war that would test both systems under maximum pressure and force a reckoning that would shape the next 50 years. The Soviet Union, despite its inefficiencies and brutal dictatorship, mobilized its entire population with terrifying speed. State control allowed it to redirect every resource toward survival. Factories that made tractors started making tanks. Women and children worked in munitions plants. The entire economy became a war machine. And it worked. The Soviets held Stalingrad. They pushed the Nazis back. They reached Berlin. Meanwhile, the United States transformed into an industrial superpower. Private companies, coordinated by the government, produced weapons, ships, and aircraft at a scale that stunned the world. American capitalism proved it could innovate, adapt, and mobilize when necessary. And when the war ended in 1945, the scoreboard wasn't ideological anymore. It was concrete. GDP, infrastructure, military power, living standards. And from 1945 to 1991, the world became a laboratory, the largest social experiment in human history. On one side, the Soviet bloc, central planning, state ownership, suppressed markets. On the other, the United States and its allies, regulated capitalism, private enterprise, markets with safety nets learned from the Depression. This wasn't about manifestos. This wasn't about theory. This was millions of people living the consequences. And the results would be as dramatic as they were painful. The early decades looked promising for the Soviets. Rapid industrialization. Literacy rates soared from 40% to 99%. Free healthcare. Free education. Housing for everyone. Military power that rivaled America. To many observers, especially in the developing world, the Soviet model looked like it was delivering. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Without price signals, the economy drifted into absurd inefficiency. Factories met production quotas by making unusable goods. Nail factories produced one giant nail instead of thousands of small ones because quotas measured weight, not utility. Farms delivered rotten harvests, and innovation stagnated. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union was decades behind in consumer technology. A country that put the first satellite in space, that put the first human in orbit, couldn't produce a decent refrigerator or television. The gap was becoming undeniable. Capitalism, meanwhile, adapted. After the Great Depression, Western governments learned. They introduced regulation, deposit insurance, antitrust laws, social security, public health care systems, unemployment benefits. Capitalism didn't become fair, but it became survivable, and that adaptability became its ultimate weapon. By the 1980s, the gap in living standards was impossible to ignore. West Germany versus East Germany, the same nation split in half, running parallel experiments. By 1989, West Germans were earning almost double what East Germans made. The stores in West Germany overflowed with goods. The stores in East Germany had empty shelves and lines stretching around blocks. North Korea versus South Korea. In 1953, Both were devastated by war. Both were agricultural economies with similar starting points. By 1980, South Korea had become an industrial powerhouse. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, rising wages, growing middle class. North Korea remained frozen in time, dependent on Soviet aid just to avoid starvation. The pattern was clear across the globe. Everywhere capitalism and socialism competed directly, capitalism was winning. Not perfectly, not fairly, but undeniably. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet system was breaking under its own weight. Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet leader in 1985 and faced a stark reality. The economy was stagnating. Oil revenues, which had propped up the system, were falling. The war in Afghanistan was draining resources with no end in sight, and the population was losing faith. Gorbachev tried reforms: glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring. He allowed limited free speech. He permitted some market mechanisms. He tried to save socialism by introducing elements of capitalism, but the reforms exposed just how broken the system was. Once people could speak freely, they revealed how bad things had become. Chronic shortages of basic goods, crumbling infrastructure, corruption at every level, technology that was generations behind the West. And something else happened, something nobody predicted. Eastern Europe began to crack. Poland, 1980. Shipyard workers in Gdansk formed Solidarity, the first independent trade union in a communist country. The movement grew. Millions joined. The Polish government tried to crush it, but the spirit of resistance had taken root. Hungary, 1989. The government started dismantling border fences with Austria. East Germans started fleeing through Hungary to reach the West. Thousands became tens of thousands. Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution. Peaceful protests filled Prague. The communist government fell without a shot fired. But the moment that symbolized everything, the image that captured the end of an era, happened on November 9th, 1989, Berlin. For 28 years, the Berlin Wall had physically divided capitalism from socialism. Families separated, friends divided. A concrete and barbed wire barrier enforced by armed guards with orders to shoot anyone trying to cross. On the night of November 9th, East German authorities, overwhelmed by pressure and confused by their own announcements, opened the checkpoints. East Berliners flooded across. People climbed the wall. They danced on top of it. They attacked it with hammers and pickaxes. They tore it down with their bare hands. Families reunited. Strangers embraced. And the world watched as the most visible symbol of socialist control crumbled into rubble. Within a year, communist regimes across Eastern Europe collapsed like dominoes. Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, gone. And on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. Gorbachev resigned. The red flag came down from the Kremlin. 15 republics declared independence. A superpower with 30,000 nuclear weapons dissolved without a war. Not from invasion, from internal economic failure. The debt couldn't be serviced. The system couldn't adapt. And 74 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, the grand socialist experiment was over. The early 1990s felt like a verdict. History had spoken. Capitalism works. Socialism doesn't. Politicians declared victory. Economists wrote papers proving the superiority of markets. Francis Fukuyama published a book arguing this was the end of history itself. Liberal capitalism plus democracy had won. There was no viable alternative left. The future would be capitalist, democratic, and peaceful. Former socialist countries rushed to privatize industries. Stock markets opened across Eastern Europe. Free markets would bring prosperity. Democracy would bring freedom. The West had won the Cold War, and everyone would now adopt the winning system. It seemed obvious. It seemed inevitable. It seemed final. Except it wasn't. Because while capitalism celebrated its victory, while the Soviet collapse seemed to prove that markets were superior to planning, something else was happening. Capitalism's triumph lap didn't last long, and the problems that had plagued it before the Cold War came roaring back. The 1990s and 2000s saw globalization spread capitalism nearly everywhere. Markets liberalized, trade barriers fell, investment flowed across borders. And yes, the results were remarkable in many ways. China, still ruled by the Communist Party but running a capitalist economy in everything but name, lifted 700 million people out of extreme poverty, the largest poverty reduction in human history. India liberalized its economy and saw massive growth. By 2015, less than 10% of humans lived in extreme poverty, down from 40% in 1980. This was capitalism's strongest evidence. It delivers growth, it creates wealth, it raises living standards. But there was a cost, and that cost was becoming impossible to ignore. Inequality exploded. In the United States, the wealth gap hit levels not seen since the 1920s. By 2025, the richest 1% of people were capturing 20% of global income. In America, billionaires multiplied while wages for ordinary workers stagnated. Healthcare became unaffordable. Housing prices soared beyond what middle-class families could reach. Student debt crushed young people. The promise that capitalism lifts all boats looked increasingly hollow when the yachts were rising and the rowboats were sinking. And then came 2008, the global financial crisis, a meltdown triggered by reckless speculation and greed on Wall Street, mortgage-backed securities, derivatives, bets on bets on bets. The entire system teetered on the edge of collapse. Governments stepped in with trillions in bailouts, taxes. Dollars saved banks that had gambled with other people's money. The bankers kept their bonuses. The homeowners lost their houses. And millions of people who had believed capitalism was stable, efficient, and fair began to question everything. By the 2010s, socialism started creeping back into the conversation. Not Soviet-style central planning, not state ownership of everything, but the core socialist idea that maybe, just maybe, unchecked capitalism wasn't delivering for ordinary people. In the United States, Bernie Sanders, a self-described democratic socialist, nearly won the Democratic presidential nomination. Twice. In the United Kingdom, Jeremy Corbyn led the Labour Party on an explicitly socialist platform and came close to power. Polls showed younger generations viewing socialism favorably. 50% of young adults in some Western countries said they preferred socialism to capitalism. This wasn't nostalgia for the Soviet Union. This was a reaction to what capitalism had become: massive inequality, unaffordable healthcare, climate change driven by unregulated extraction, a sense that the system worked for billionaires and corporations but not for regular people. And then there was the case that complicated the entire narrative: China. China remained politically authoritarian. One-party rule, no free speech, no democracy. But economically, China had embraced markets, private companies, competition, profit incentives. Deng Xiaoping's reforms after 1978 unleashed capitalism within a socialist political framework, and it worked. China's economy grew at double-digit rates for decades. By 2025, China was the second largest economy in the world and closing in on the United States. Chinese companies competed globally. Chinese infrastructure surpassed America's in many areas. And this created a new question. If China could achieve massive growth without democracy, without Western-style capitalism, what did that mean for the entire debate? Maybe the dichotomy was false. Maybe it wasn't capitalism or socialism. Maybe it was about finding the right mix. And that's where the story gets genuinely interesting. Because when you look at the countries with the highest living standards, the lowest inequality, the best health outcomes, and the most satisfied populations, they're not purely capitalist or purely socialist. They're mixed economies. The Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland. These nations have free markets, private enterprise, global corporations, IKEA, Volvo, Nokia. But they also have high taxes, strong unions, universal health care, free education, generous parental leave, robust social safety nets. They blend the innovation and efficiency of capitalism with the equality and security of socialism. And the results speak for themselves. High GDP per capita, low poverty, long life expectancy, high happiness rankings. The Nordic model proves something both capitalists and socialists often ignore. You don't have to choose one extreme. You can combine the strengths of both systems. So which works better, capitalism or socialism? After exploring a century of history, after watching the Soviet Union collapse and capitalism stumble, after seeing China rise and inequality explode, the answer isn't simple. Both systems have remarkable strengths. Capitalism drives innovation. It rewards risk. It creates wealth at a scale socialism never matched. The poverty reduction of the past 40 years is real. The technology boom is real. The entrepreneurship and dynamism are real. But capitalism also generates instability. It concentrates wealth. It creates winners and losers. And without regulation, it produces inequality that tears societies apart. Socialism, at least in theory, promises something capitalism often fails to deliver: equal opportunity, dignity for all, healthcare and education as rights, not privileges. And in some cases, socialist-inspired policies have delivered impressive results. Cuba's healthcare system, the Nordic countries' social protections, high literacy rates in former Soviet states. But pure socialism, the kind the Soviet Union tried to implement, fails. It stifles innovation, it creates inefficiency, and it requires authoritarian control to maintain, because when people can't choose, they have to be forced. The uncomfortable truth is that neither pure capitalism nor pure socialism has delivered utopia. Each solved some problems while creating others. And the most successful economies in the modern world are the ones that stopped treating this as a binary choice. They took the best of both: markets for efficiency and innovation, government for regulation and redistribution, competition for growth, safety nets for stability. This isn't ideological purity. This is pragmatism. It's adapting to reality instead of clinging to theory. Because at the end of the day, economic systems don't shape people nearly as much as people shape economic systems. Human nature doesn't change under capitalism or socialism. Greed, ambition, compassion, laziness, creativity, all of it exists regardless of the system. Under pure capitalism, greed becomes innovation until it becomes exploitation. Under pure socialism, equality becomes solidarity until it becomes repression. Different systems, same human tendencies. The question isn't which ideology is morally superior. The question is which system has the best mechanisms to harness human nature's strengths and restrain its weaknesses. And history's answer is clear. The system that adapts wins. Capitalism survived because it could reinvent itself. From laissez-faire to the New Deal, to social democracy, to tech capitalism, it evolved. Socialism collapsed where it refused to change. The Soviet Union, Maoist China, North Korea, rigid, brittle, unable to adapt. But socialism thrived where it merged with markets. Scandinavia. Post-1978 China, despite its China. Authoritarianism. Parts of Western Europe. Ideology didn't decide the winners. Flexibility did. Look at the modern world. Every major economy is mixed. The United States has Social Security and Medicare. China has private corporations and state-owned enterprises. Scandinavia has capitalism and socialism in roughly equal measure. Nobody runs pure systems anymore because reality forced compromise. The debate isn't capitalism versus socialism. The debate is about the ratio. How much market? How much state? How much freedom? How much equality? And the answer varies depending on what you value and what problems you're trying to solve. Right now, in 2025, the world faces challenges neither system was designed to handle. Climate change, artificial intelligence, demographic collapse, global debt, pandemics. Capitalism struggles with long-term planning and collective action problems. Socialism struggles with innovation and individual freedom. The countries that will thrive in the next century are the ones that can combine the creativity of markets with the resilience of public investment, private innovation with public direction, freedom with stability. This isn't about choosing teams. This isn't about declaring one system the winner. This is about recognizing that the longest ideological war in modern history ended without a clear victor because both sides were partially right and partially wrong. Capitalism creates wealth but distributes it unequally. Socialism distributes fairly but struggles to create wealth. The future belongs to whoever can balance these trade-offs most effectively. So when you look at that satellite image of Korea, when you see the lights in the south and the darkness in the north, you're not seeing proof that capitalism won. You're seeing proof that extreme versions of either system fail. North Korea didn't fail because socialism is inherently broken. It failed because a rigid, totalitarian version of socialism with no markets and no freedom can't function. South Korea didn't succeed because capitalism is perfect. It succeeded because it combined markets with government coordination, competition with industrial policy, and freedom with social investment. The same pattern appears everywhere you look. Cuba keeps people alive longer than America despite poverty because it invested in healthcare. But its economy stagnates because it lacks market mechanisms to drive growth. China lifted hundreds of millions from poverty by embracing markets. But its authoritarian control prevents the full flourishing of human potential. America created the most innovative economy in history, but its inequality and healthcare crisis show that markets alone don't guarantee human welfare. The lesson is clear. Neither pure capitalism nor pure socialism works. The answer is balance. The challenge is finding it. And the next chapter of this story, the chapter being written right now, will determine whether humanity can take the best of both systems and build something better than either one alone. Because the debate was never really about capitalism versus socialism. It was about power, who controls it, how it's used, and whether we can create systems that harness human potential without crushing human dignity. History doesn't give easy answers, but it gives us data. It shows us what works and what fails. And if we're willing to learn from it, if we're willing to admit that ideological purity matters less than results, then maybe we can finally move past this century-old fight and build economies that serve people instead of forcing people to serve them. That's the real question, not which system is better, but whether we're wise enough to stop fighting about labels and start focusing on outcomes. The answer is still being written. And every generation has to figure it out again for themselves. If this changed how you see the debate, if you finally understand why this question has no simple answer, then you're starting to see how the world actually works. Subscribe, because the economic systems we live under aren't accidents of history. They're choices. And understanding how we got here is the first step to deciding where we go next.